Right now, the fabric of our inner solar system is physically shrinking. That is not a metaphor. That is a measured reality. But the incoming blast of 2 million mile per hour solar wind isn't the part that has forecasters alarmed. This shock wave is violently colliding with a precise 5-planet alignment, a twin plasma strike on Mars, and a vaporizing comet. Are we watching a temporary celestial glitch, or the terrifying new physics of our atmosphere? We are dissecting a convergence of events that astrodynamicists and heliophysicists rarely observe outside of hypothetical supercomputer simulations. If this level of unvarnished, data-driven analysis of our solar system has you hooked, subscribe to the channel. Let us begin. Part 1. The statistical impossibility of late April. Consider the mechanics of a standard orbital calendar. The solar system operates on deeply isolated independent clocks. The Sun rotates on a 27-day equatorial cycle. Planets orbit on rigid tracks measured in years or decades, and comets plunge inward from the Oort cloud on trajectories that span millennia. They do not coordinate. Yet, in late April 2026, 4 vastly different physical mechanisms have synchronized within a singular 72-hour window. We are tracking a severe Earth-facing coronal hole, a geometrically precise alignment of Earth, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, and Neptune, a dual interplanetary coronal mass ejection headed for the Martian surface, and the perihelion of Comet C 2025 R3 PANSTARRS. When you attempt to calculate the intersecting probabilities of a trans-Neptunian comet plunging past the Sun, a rare heliocentric longitude alignment of 5 distinct planetary masses and a gaping void in the solar corona discharging plasma at peak velocity, the resulting number approaches 0. The math breaks. We are not witnessing a rare event. We are not witnessing an unusual sequence. We are witnessing a statistical impossibility. To be absolutely clear, we must draw a firm line between coincidence and causation. The orbital mechanics of Saturn and Neptune did not pull the comet into the inner solar system, nor did the comet's icy nucleus tear open the Sun's magnetic field. The genesis of these 4 events is entirely independent. The physics do not support a shared origin, but their simultaneous arrival creates an overlapping field of intense kinetic interference. The variables have merged. Right now, we are observing a localized destabilization of the heliospheric current sheet, the rippling, invisible skirt of magnetic energy radiating outward from the Sun's equator. When you introduce a high-speed solar wind stream into a spatial environment already gravitationally strained by planetary alignments and chemically saturated with a comet's ionized outgassing, the entire system structurally alters. It is not simply wind blowing past dead rocks in a vacuum. It is water rushing into a rapidly narrowing pipe, building immense internal pressure until the structural limits of the conduit are tested. The inner solar system has temporarily transformed into a highly conductive resonant acoustic chamber, and Earth is sitting directly in the path of the current. Part 2. The void on the Sun. Look at the star at the center of our system through an extreme ultraviolet filter right now, and you will see a massive, jagged shadow dominating the southern hemisphere and bleeding across the equator. It spans roughly 600,000 kilometers across its widest axis. You could drop 50 Earths into this dark expanse and still have room for the gas giants. It is a coronal hole. To understand the threat, we must first correct a fundamental misconception about solar architecture. A coronal hole is not a physical crater excavated into the blinding surface of the photosphere. It is a structural magnetic rupture. Under normal conditions, the Sun is encased in a closed magnetic field where invisible lines of force loop out from the surface and immediately plunge back down, trapping superheated plasma in towering, brilliantly glowing arches. It is a tightly sealed pressure vessel, but inside the dark region we are monitoring today, that complex magnetic architecture has failed. The lines do not loop, they snap open, extending straight out into the freezing vacuum of deep space, offering zero electromagnetic resistance to the solar material boiling furiously beneath them. The seal is broken, the pressure drops, the plasma escapes. Because these highly charged particles are no longer contained by magnetic tension, the physical density of the region plummets, causing its thermal output to drop relative to the surrounding atmosphere. This is why the anomaly appears as a terrifying pitch-black void on our satellite telemetry. It looks to the untrained eye like a localized death of the star. It is, in reality, a wide-open exhaust valve, venting the sun's internal mass directly into the void. Coronal holes are standard features of the solar cycle, usually confined to the benign, non-threatening upper latitudes near the sun's poles, where their emissions radiate harmlessly out of the orbital plane. But the anomaly of April 2026 is its precise geometric positioning. This specific void has migrated down to the solar equator. It is pointing straight down the barrel. When a magnetic aperture of this immense magnitude aligns with the ecliptic plane, the flat, invisible disk where the planets orbit, it guarantees that the resulting plasma stream will not pass harmlessly over our heads or beneath our feet. It is a direct, inescapable physical collision. We must also factor in the rotation of the star. The sun turns on its axis once every 27 days. As this gaping equatorial hole sweeps across the Earth-facing side of the sun, it acts mathematically like an uncontrolled lawn sprinkler, spraying a continuous, uninterrupted hose of protons and electrons into the dark. Because the sun continues to spin while the plasma travels forward, this stream bends outward into a vast, sweeping curve known as the Parker spiral. We are not bracing for a brief, transient puff of solar wind. We are waiting to be violently swept up by a relentless, rotating blade of highly energized stellar material. The sheer duration of the incoming exposure is the variable that elevates this from a minor meteorological footnote to a highly consequential global hazard. The sun has left the door open, and the atmosphere inside is rushing out. Part 3. The physics of the fast solar wind. The space between the Earth and the sun is never truly empty. It is permeated by the ambient solar wind, a steady outward flow of charged particles that forms the baseline weather of our solar system. Under normal conditions, this background plasma drifts past our planet at roughly 1 million miles per hour. That is the baseline. The plasma bleeding from the current equatorial coronal hole is not adhering to this speed limit. Because the magnetic field lines over this void have snapped open, the escaping protons and electrons face zero electromagnetic resistance. Deep within these open funnels, rippling oscillations of magnetic tension known as Alf-Wen waves act like acoustic whips, lashing the plasma outward. Stripped of the sun's gravitational and magnetic drag, the particles accelerate to nearly 2 million miles per hour. The velocity doubles, the kinetic energy quadruples. The void becomes a hammer. To understand the physical threat this poses, we must look at what happens in the silent, invisible space halfway between the sun and the Earth. When a 2 million mile per hour stream of plasma is fired into a region of space already occupied by a 1 million mile per hour stream, a brutal kinetic collision occurs. In the vacuum of space, there is no air friction to gradually slow the faster wind down, and there is nowhere for the slower wind to go. The fast wind violently rear-ends the slow wind. This creates a phenomenon heliophysicists call a co-rotating interaction region, or CI. Consider the mechanics of a snowplow racing down a highway. As the blade pushes forward, it accumulates a dense, compacted wall of ice and debris ahead of it. The CIR is that blade. It is a localized, highly magnetized shockwave composed of violently compressed plasma. It forcefully compacts the ambient solar wind into a dense, turbulent wall of protons. It compresses the ambient plasma. It amplifies the magnetic field. It drives a shockwave directly into the planetary orbits. This is the exact structure currently racing toward Earth. When this event reaches us, we will not simply experience a gradual increase in solar wind speed. We will be hit by the snowplow. Satellite telemetry positioned at Lagrange Point 1, roughly 1 million miles upstream of Earth, will record a sudden vertical spike in plasma density. The number of particles per cubic centimeter will jump tenfold in a matter of minutes. Immediately following this dense wall of compressed debris, the high-speed stream itself will arrive, plunging the Earth into a sustained, multi-day bombardment of high-velocity radiation. We are tracking a two-stage kinetic assault. The first stage is a dense, crushing wall of magnetic pressure. The second stage is a relentless, high-speed sandblaster of charged particles. This is not a theoretical model. This is the physical mass currently transiting the inner solar system, and our planet is locked squarely in its crosshairs. Part 4. The Earth's magnetic shield. We are taught from a young age that Earth possesses a magnetic shield. We picture a rigid, impenetrable dome of energy deflecting the hazards of space. This is a fatal oversimplification. The magnetosphere is not a wall. It is a fluid, highly compressible membrane of magnetic resonance generated by the spinning, molten iron deep within the planet's outer core. Under normal, quiet space weather conditions, this invisible bubble extends roughly 40,000 miles toward the Sun, gently parting the baseline solar wind like the bow of a ship parting calm water. But when the co-rotating interaction region, the dense, magnetized snowplow of plasma we discussed in Part 3, slams into the bow shock, the physics abruptly change. The shield does not hold its ground. It collapses inward as the kinetic pressure of the incoming 2 million mile/hour solar wind spikes the day side of Earth's magnetosphere is violently crushed. Imagine a balloon squeezed between two opposing hands. The front of the magnetic field, normally suspended tens of thousands of miles out in the vacuum, is physically shoved down toward the planet's upper atmosphere. If the compression is severe enough, the boundary line of our protection, the magnetars, can be pushed inward past geosynchronous orbit. When this happens, the orbital mechanics of our modern world are compromised. Our highest flying communication, navigation, and weather satellites are suddenly left outside the shield. They are stripped of their magnetic protection. They are submerged in raw, unfiltered stellar radiation. Yet, the true kinetic threat does not unfold on the day side facing the Sun. It manifests in the dark void behind our planet. Because the magnetosphere is a fluid dynamic, it does not just compress in the front, it aggressively elongates in the back. As the relentless, high-speed wind blasts past the Earth, it creates intense friction along the flanks of our magnetic bubble. It drags Earth's magnetic field lines with it, stretching them out into a massive, invisible windsock known as the magnetotail. This tail reaches hundreds of thousands of miles into deep space, extending well past the orbit of the Moon. As the high-speed stream continues to batter the planet hour after hour, day after day, the magnetotail is stretched further. The magnetic field lines are pulled tighter, the tension builds. They become infinitely stretched rubber bands holding billions of tons of charged plasma. Eventually, the physical limits of the heliospheric geometry are reached. The lines snap. Through a violent, instantaneous process known as magnetic reconnection, the highly stressed magnetic lines sever and instantly fuse together in a simpler, lower-energy configuration. The excess energy from this snap does not safely dissipate into the vacuum. It creates a slingshot. The reconnected magnetic lines violently whip back toward the night side of the Earth, accelerating trapped plasma straight down the magnetic poles at terrifying speeds. The shield does not simply block the solar wind. It absorbs the kinetic energy, stores it in the dark expanse behind our planet, and then violently weaponizes it against the upper atmosphere. The membrane is buckling, the energy is loading. The impact is imminent. Part 5. The mechanics of a G3 geomagnetic storm. When the magnetotail violently snaps and slingshots its trapped plasma back toward the Earth, millions of amps of electricity are driven straight down into the polar upper atmosphere. The ionosphere ignites. The sky physically glows. This is the genesis of a G3 geomagnetic storm. We classify space weather on a scale of 1 to 5. AG3 is officially designated by forecasters as strong. To understand the exact physical toll this takes on human infrastructure, we must rely on the fundamental laws of electromagnetism. When you rapidly fluctuate a magnetic field across a conductive wire, you generate an electrical current within that wire. This principle of induction is how every mechanical power plant on Earth generates electricity. During a severe geomagnetic storm, the magnetic field of the entire planet is vibrating, compressing, and violently oscillating under the relentless pressure of the high-speed solar wind. The conductive wire is our global high-voltage electrical grid. The atmosphere has become a massive invisible alternator. The resulting physical manifestation is known as a geomagnetically induced current, or GIC. To prevent localized lightning strikes and electrical faults from destroying equipment, the world's high-voltage power grids are physically grounded deep into the Earth. Under normal conditions, this is a vital safety mechanism. During a G3 storm, it becomes a critical vulnerability. As the highly charged auroral electrojets race through the upper atmosphere, they induce massive rogue electrical currents in the ground beneath them. Because standard earth and rock are relatively poor conductors of electricity, this ground current desperately seeks the path of least resistance. It finds our grounding wires. It surges up from the soil and infiltrates the copper and aluminum transmission lines spanning the continents. This is not alternating current, AC, the rhythmic oscillating power our grid is designed to handle. This is an intrusion of direct current, DC. The transmission lines themselves do not melt. The steel towers do not fall. The structural failure occurs within the step-up and step-down transformers. When this alien, low-frequency direct current floods into a high-voltage transformer, it forces the device's iron core into magnetic saturation. The machine instantly loses its ability to smoothly regulate power. The physical symptoms of this saturation are immediate and terrifying. The massive iron cores begin to vibrate wildly. They emit a deafening, low-frequency acoustic hum. They rapidly bake themselves from the inside out. During a sustained G3 event, automated voltage regulators across the hemisphere are forced to make continuous, rapid-fire corrections to prevent the entire network from fracturing under the thermal strain. Protective relays blindly trip, mistaking the solar-induced current for a catastrophic short circuit. Simultaneously, the radiation aggressively heats the upper atmosphere, causing it to physically expand outward and act like aerodynamic quicksand on low Earth orbit satellites. Voltage begins to sag. Transformers begin to hum. The grid begins to bleed. The infrastructure is tested to its absolute thermal and algorithmic limits, but the electrical saturation of our planet does not stop at the high-tension wires on the surface. The induction process penetrates much deeper. It travels downward into the crust, down into the dark. Part 6. The lithosphere connection. If you ask a traditional seismologist what causes an earthquake, the answer is absolute. Deep beneath our feet, radioactive decay heats the mantle, creating slow, churning convection currents. These currents drag the massive, rigid tectonic plates across the surface of the globe. At the boundaries where these plates meet, friction locks them together. The mantle keeps pushing, the stress builds. Eventually, the friction is overcome, the rock violently ruptures, and the ground shakes. This is the foundational law of orthodox geology. It treats the Earth as a closed, mechanical system, but orthodox geology has a blind spot. It fundamentally ignores the sky. To understand the deeply sobering, albeit highly controversial, data correlating space weather with seismic activity, we must be intellectually honest about what the data actually says. We must establish a strict boundary of causation. The sun does not create earthquakes. The solar wind does not move continents. A coronal hole cannot generate the immense subterranean kinetic energy required to snap a tectonic plate. Those forces are entirely internal. But the data, compiled from decades of statistical anomalies and recently modeled by geophysicists studying ionospheric disturbances, suggests something far more subtle. The sun does not load the gun, it simply alters the sensitivity of the trigger. When the co-rotating interaction region compresses our magnetic field, the magnetosphere does not just shrink in the vacuum of space. The physical boundaries of our planet's electromagnetic environment are violently shoved downward, compressing the ionosphere. This atmospheric layer becomes hypersaturated with negatively charged electrons. Because the Earth's surface and the ionosphere are electrically conductive, they act together as a massive, planetary-scale capacitor. Capacitive coupling is the same physics that allows a touchscreen to register the electrical charge of your finger without physically clicking a button. When the charge in the upper atmosphere spikes, it violently alters the electrical baseline of the ground below it. This sudden, massive influx of electrostatic pressure does not stop at the topsoil. It penetrates deep into the crust. Consider a fault line like the Cascadia subduction zone or the San Andreas. These are deeply fractured regions of rock, already warped and groaning under millions of tons of mechanical pressure. They are locked, waiting for the final microscopic imbalance to push them past the threshold of failure. When the global electrical grid becomes saturated by a G3 geomagnetic storm, the microscopic voids and fluids within these subterranean fault zones are simultaneously flooded with intense, induced electric fields. The electrostatic pressure inside the rock spikes. The atomic friction holding the tectonic plates together is temporarily violently altered. We are not observing a sunbeam cracking the Earth. We are observing a highly charged electromagnetic shockwave flowing into a critically stressed subterranean fracture. We are watching the friction coefficient of a loaded fault line change in real time under the invisible weight of the sun. The pressure from below is constant, but the electromagnetic lock holding it back is currently degrading. Part 7. Piezoelectricity and the deep crust. To understand how an electrical storm in the sky translates into a massive seismic rupture in the dark, we must examine the atomic structure of the rock beneath our feet. The Earth's continental crust is not a uniform block of dead, inert material. It is a highly complex crystalline matrix, heavily composed of granite. And granite is profoundly rich in quartz. This is not a trivial geological footnote. It is the core mechanical vulnerability in the chain of events we are currently monitoring. Quartz is a piezoelectricity dictator rigid two-way relationship between mechanical stress and electrical charge. If you subject a quartz crystal to intense physical pressure, its internal atomic geometry shifts, forcing a separation of positive and negative charges. It bleeds an electrical voltage. This is not a theoretical model. It is the exact, everyday physical mechanism inside a standard push-button grill lighter. You forcefully compress a small crystal, you generate a high-voltage spark. But physics demands symmetry. The inverse piezoelectric effect is equally relentless, and far more terrifying in this context. If you inject a high-voltage electrical field into a static quartz crystal, the material physically reacts to the current. It expands, it contracts, it deforms. The physical geometry of the rock itself is forcefully altered by the invisible flow of electrons. Now, scale this molecular reality up to a planetary crisis. When the G3 geomagnetic storm slams into the Earth's magnetic shield, the massive electrical currents induced by the collision do not merely seek out our high-voltage power grids. They travel deep underground. Geologists call these deep Earth electrical rivers telluric currents. We are talking about millions of amps of low-frequency, ungrounded direct current surging blindly through the crystalline lattice of the Earth's crust. Because electricity always seeks the path of least resistance, these telluric currents do not spread evenly through solid bedrock. They aggressively funnel into regions of structural weakness. They flood into fault lines. A major fault zone, packed with crushed rock and saturated with highly conductive, saline-rich groundwater, acts as a massive subterranean lightning rod. It draws the current in. When this massive influx of solar-induced electricity hits the pulverized quartz-rich rock locked inside a high-tension fault, the inverse piezoelectric effect violently activates. Geologists call the microscopic jagged teeth that lock a fault line together asperities. These microscopic friction points are the only mechanism preventing billions of tons of compressed tectonic rock from sliding abruptly forward. When the telluric current floods the fault, the quartz crystals comprising these asperities are electrified. They immediately react, they vibrate, they expand, they distort. This microscopic localized deformation fundamentally alters the friction coefficient of the entire fault zone. The rigid, jagged teeth holding the tectonic plates in place are forcefully warped. Simultaneously, the intense electrostatic charge rapidly heats the trapped groundwater, causing sudden spikes in subterranean pore pressure. The fault is physically lubricated by expanding steam and structurally degraded by deformed crystal matrices. The grip loosens. The massive, planetary-scale currents injected by the solar wind do not possess the raw kinetic energy required to push a continent. They do not need to. They only need to disrupt the microscopic atomic friction holding the continent back. The sun provides the electrical current. The quartz provides the mechanical deformation. The Earth provides the devastating kinetic release. The lock is heavily electrified. The pins are slipping. The plates are ready to slide. Part 8. The February 2026 precedent. To dismiss this electromagnetic fault lubrication theory as fringe science, one must actively ignore the forensic telemetry recorded just 27 days ago. Because the sun rotates on its equatorial axis roughly once every 27 days, the terrifying coronal hole we are currently tracking is not a newly formed structure. It is a returning threat. It has survived a full rotation on the far side of the star, and it is now pointing at us again. When this exact same void swept its high-speed plasma stream across the Earth during its previous transit, initiating the massive Pacific seismic burst of late February 2026, the correlation was precise, measurable, and highly alarming. We do not have to guess what this specific co-rotating interaction region does to the lithosphere. We simply have to look at the seismological data from the last time it struck. On February 11, 2026, as the leading edge of this solar wind stream began to severely compress our magnetosphere, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake ruptured near Tonga in the South Pacific. But the magnitude is not the anomaly, the depth is the anomaly. This quake originated at a staggering depth of 515 kilometers. It did not happen in the brittle shallow crust, it happened deep within the mantle transition zone. exactly where intense, highly pressurized fluid matrices are most susceptible to sudden piezoelectric charging. Over the following 2 weeks, as the solar wind bombardment sustained its pressure, the entire Pacific Ring of Fire structurally destabilized. The planetary telluric current surged into the heavily stressed subduction zones of the Western Pacific. On February 22nd, a magnitude 6.1 tore through the Aleutian Trench in the Bering Sea. By February 28th, a rapid-fire swarm of magnitude 5.0 and 5.1 quakes violently shook the East China Sea near Miyakojima, Japan. Concurrently, an unprecedented swarm of over 6,000 localized microquakes ignited across global fault systems. Orthodox geologists recorded this as a standard, albeit unusually active, clustering of tectonic release. Heliophysicists recorded it as a textbook lithospheric response to a severely degraded magnetic shield. Look at the overlapping timelines. The satellite telemetry at Lagrange point 1 shows the solar wind speed abruptly spiking. Within 48 hours, the planetary K-index, the primary measurement of geomagnetic storm intensity, surges into the red zone. And within hours of that global electrical saturation, the deepest, most compressed fault lines in the Pacific violently unlock. This is not definitively proven causation. A rigorous, intellectually honest scientist must state that tectonic plates are always under stress, and earthquakes happen every day. But the statistical clustering of these massive deep crust ruptures, aligning perfectly with the arrival of the high-speed solar stream, strips away the comfort of coincidence. The timing is vastly too precise to ignore. The forensic data from February tells a chilling, mechanical story. The sun rotated, the Earth's magnetic field absorbed the kinetic blow, the deep crust electrified, and the Pacific plate fractured. And that was 27 days ago. That was when the coronal hole was smaller. That was before the plasma stream accelerated to its current velocity of 2 million miles per hour. And crucially, that was before the gravitational and magnetic framework of the inner solar system was locked into a highly conductive 5-planet alignment. The planetary geology is heavily stressed, but this time, the extraterrestrial trigger is vastly more powerful. Part 9. Planetary Alignment, the Myth versus the Math. We must begin by discarding the astrology. When the general public hears that Earth, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, and Neptune are entering a precise planetary alignment in late April 2026, the cultural instinct is to look for mystical significance. We look for omens. We picture a perfectly straight line drawn through the vacuum, like billiard balls resting on a single cosmic cue. We imagine unseen ethereal energies shifting human consciousness. This is hyperbole. It is a distraction from the vastly more terrifying physical reality. In orbital mechanics, a perfect physical line of planets, a true syzygy, is a geometric impossibility due to the varying orbital inclinations of the celestial bodies. What is actually occurring right now is a convergence of heliocentric longitude. This means that if you were standing on the surface of the Sun looking outward, you would see these 5 distinct massive planetary bodies crowded together within a narrow singular arc of the ecliptic plane. They are not in a straight line. They are clumped in a single heavy quadrant of the sky. Why does this matter? Because gravity is not a theory. Gravity is mass interacting with distance. Every planet in our solar system exerts a continuous reciprocal gravitational pull on the Sun. Under normal distributed conditions, these forces effectively balance each other out. A gas giant tugs one way, a terrestrial world tugs another, and the Sun remains structurally stable. But when you move multiple planetary masses into the same narrow heliocentric quadrant, you stop balancing the equation. You stack the variables, you create an asymmetric gravitational load. To understand the consequence of this, we must introduce the concept of the barycenter. The Sun does not sit rigidly still at the absolute dead center of the solar system. Because the planets possess immense mass, they pull the Sun slightly off-center. The entire solar system actually rotates around a shared, invisible center of mass, known as the barycenter. When heavy outer planets like Saturn and Neptune align on the exact same side of the star as the inner rocky worlds, this barycenter physically migrates. The Sun is slowly, inexorably pulled outward from its own core. This mechanical shift generates a localized gravity gradient. It induces immense, subtle tidal forces across the Sun's outer plasma layers. Just as the Moon's gravity pulls the Earth's liquid oceans to create a physical bulge of high tide, The stacked gravity of an alignment pulls on the Sun's convective zone. It creates a physical, measurable bulge of superheated plasma. We are not talking about a metaphysical connection. We are talking about cold, Newtonian mechanics. Millions of tons of charged stellar material are being subjected to an anomalous mechanical stress. And this gravitational tidal bulge is occurring right at the exact moment a massive equatorial coronal hole has unsealed the magnetic field in that very same region. The planetary alignment did not tear open the Sun. It did not create the incoming 2 million mile/hour solar wind, but it is fundamentally altering the gravitational architecture of the inner solar system precisely as the plasma escapes. The Sun is venting its atmosphere. The wound is open. The gravity is pulling. Part 10. The inner orbit conjunction. Space is defined by distance. The physical void separating Mercury, Earth, and Mars is measured in tens of millions of miles. To the naked eye, they are deeply isolated rocks, suspended in a sterile, disconnected vacuum. But astrophysics does not rely on the naked eye. In the realm of electromagnetism, these three planets are not isolated at all. They are currently tethered together by a highly conductive structural anomaly. As the solar wind radiates outward from the Sun, it carries the star's magnetic field with it. This sprawling invisible network is known as the Interplanetary Magnetic Field, or IMF. Under normal staggered orbital conditions, the IMF washes over each planet individually, creating separate, isolated interactions. The plasma hits a planetary shield, creates a localized wake, and slowly dissipates into the void. But when Mercury, Earth, and Mars share a precise heliocentric longitude, they are threaded by the exact same spiraling magnetic field lines. The geometry stacks, the fields merge, the isolation ends. To understand the mechanics of this connection, we must look to the gas giants. Between Jupiter and its volcanic moon, Io, a permanent structural phenomenon known as a magnetic flux tube exists. It is a heavily magnetized, cylindrical region of space where the magnetic field lines are perfectly parallel. Because plasma is electrically charged, it cannot easily cross magnetic field lines. It must follow them. Therefore, a flux tube acts as a perfect frictionless conduit. It traps charged particles and aggressively funnels them from one body to the other. It is an interplanetary fiber optic cable, but instead of transmitting light, it transmits raw kinetic plasma. What astrodynamicists are monitoring in late April 2026 is the temporary structural formation of a macro-scale flux tube connecting the inner planets. As the 2 million mile/hour solar wind from the equatorial coronal hole strikes Mercury, it encounters a miniature, highly dynamic magnetosphere. Mercury does not gently deflect the wind. Due to its proximity to the Sun, the planet engages in rapid-fire magnetic reconnection, creating violent, localized plasma funnels known as flux transfer events. These events strip energy from the solar wind, but they also fundamentally organize it. As the solar wind violently passes Mercury, the plasma is highly compressed, electrically ordered, and magnetically tightened. Consider the fluid dynamics of a rushing river. If you place a single concrete piling in the water breaks around it and eventually smooths out downstream. But if you perfectly align 3 pilings in a straight line, the physics deeply change. The turbulent, high-velocity wake of the first piling feeds directly into the second, which violently accelerates the flow into the third. The water does not have the time or the space to structurally dissipate. The kinetic energy is forcefully conserved. Mercury is the first piling, Earth is the second, Mars is the third. The distance between Mercury and Earth spans roughly 48 million miles during this conjunction. Under standard conditions, a fast solar wind stream would structurally expand and weaken over this vast gulf. The physical density of the plasma would safely dilute, but within the invisible walls of an interplanetary flux tube, the expansion is heavily constrained. The parallel magnetic field lines act as an invisible pressure vessel. They force the high-speed protons to travel in a tight, highly focused column. This means the co-rotating interaction region, the compacted snowplow of magnetic debris we established in Part 3, does not lose its density before striking our planet's shield. It does not diffuse. It arrives with the kinetic profile of a point-blank impact. The alignment has created an artificial, deeply anomalous channel of low electrical resistance. The plasma escaping the Sun is utilizing this temporary flux tube as a direct highway through the inner solar system. The kinetic energy is not dissipating. The thermal shock is not degrading. The conduit is sealed, and Earth is sitting squarely in the middle of the stream. Part 11. The gas giant's gravitational anchor. To comprehend the sheer scale of the mechanics currently destabilizing the Sun, we must look to the darkest, coldest edges of the outer solar system. We must look at Saturn and Neptune. These two gas giants are millions, and in Neptune's case, billions of miles away from the inner orbit conjunction we established in Part 10. To the naked eye, they are too distant to matter. But astrophysics is not governed by proximity alone. It is governed by the immovable laws of mass and inertia. Saturn possesses 95 times the mass of Earth. Neptune carries 17 times the mass of Earth. Together, they represent an immense, icy gravitational anchor. And right now, that anchor is actively dragging the Sun out of position. This requires us to correct another fundamental flaw in how we visualize the universe. The Sun does not sit perfectly still at the dead center of the solar system while the planets revolve around it. That is a grade school approximation. In reality, gravity is a two-way street. The Sun pulls on the planets, but the planets also pull on the Sun. Because of this reciprocal tug-of-war, the entire solar system actually orbits a shared, mathematical center of gravity known as the barycenter. Imagine a playground seesaw. If a heavy adult sits on one end and a small child sits on the other, the balance point, the fulcrum, cannot be perfectly in the middle. It must shift drastically toward the adult to maintain equilibrium. The barycenter is that fulcrum. Under normal, staggered planetary conditions, the barycenter sits safely deep inside the molten interior of the Sun. The star wibbles and wobbles slightly, but it remains structurally balanced. But in late April 2026, the adult has shifted their weight. Because Saturn and Neptune have moved into the exact same heliocentric longitude as Mercury, Earth, and Mars, the solar system is violently out of balance. A massive asymmetrical gravitational load has been stacked onto one side of the seesaw. As a direct result, the barycenter of the solar system has physically migrated. It has moved from the deep interior of the Sun to a point entirely outside the Sun's surface. The star is no longer orbiting its own core. It is orbiting an empty, invisible point in space just above its photosphere. This mechanical shift is not harmless. When a ball of superheated rotating fluid like the Sun is forced to wobble off-center, immense internal friction is generated. The gravitational drag from Saturn and Neptune reaches back across billions of miles and exerts a minute yet highly consequential tidal force on the Sun's outer convective layers. It literally pulls the plasma. Consider the timing. At the exact moment this planetary alignment forces the Sun's barycenter outward, creating an anomalous mechanical tidal bulge of superheated plasma, the massive equatorial coronal hole we discussed in Part 2 is sweeping across that precise region. The magnetic seal has failed right where the gravitational tidal pressure is peaking. The distant gas giants are not generating the solar wind. They do not possess the electromagnetic authority to sever the Sun's magnetic field lines, but their combined stacked mass is physically squeezing the star's convective zone, forcefully expediting the evacuation of plasma through the unsealed void. The outer planets are applying the pressure, the inner planets are providing the conductive channel, and the Earth is standing in the doorway. Part 12. Interplanetary magnetic field lines. The vacuum of space is not an empty, disconnected void. It is heavily wired. To understand how a massive plasma void on the Sun is actively communicating with a five-planet alignment, we must map the invisible architecture of the heliosphere. As the solar wind violently boils off the surface of the Sun, it does not leave the star's magnetic field behind. It physically drags the field with it. The escaping plasma and the magnetic field lines are literally frozen together, locked in a state governed by the rigid laws of magnetohydrodynamics. The wind pulls the field guides the wind. They are structurally inseparable. But the Sun is not stationary. It is a massive, spinning sphere, completing a full equatorial rotation every 27 days. Because the star is spinning while simultaneously blasting its magnetic field outward into the void, the field lines do not travel in straight radials. They bend, they curve, they sweep outward in a massive, mathematically perfect Archimedean curve known to astrophysicists as the Parker spiral. To visualize this, picture a rapidly rotating lawn sprinkler firing streams of water. The water droplets travel straight outward, but the geometric pattern they form is a continuous, outward-moving spiral. This sweeping spiral is the structural foundation of the solar system, and crucially, these magnetic field lines possess actual physical tension. They are not hypothetical lines on a chalkboard. They behave like deeply stressed elastic bands, capable of stretching, violently snapping, and transferring immense kinetic energy across billions of miles. Under normal, staggered orbital conditions, this sweeping spiral expands smoothly, distributing its magnetic tension evenly across the scattered planets. The spiral breathes, the tension dissipates, the plasma safely dilutes. But in late April 2026, the geometric distribution has failed. Earth, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, and Neptune have moved into the exact same quadrant of the heliosphere. We have placed 5 massive, electromagnetically active bodies in a tightly grouped, sequential formation. In the mechanics of the Parker spiral, these planets do not act as passive rocks in a vacuum. They act as heavy, conductive anchor points. They act as frets on the fingerboard of the solar system. As the rotating magnetic field sweeps across this dense planetary cluster, the field lines snag. They are magnetically tethered by the sequential drag of 5 planetary wakes. Because the planets are grouped so closely in heliocentric longitude, the spiral cannot smoothly expand between them. The lines are pulled taut. The tension geometrically escalates. We are watching a theoretical physics model come to terrifying life. The 5-planet alignment is mathematically tightening the interplanetary magnetic field lines like strings on an instrument. Why is this highly consequential for Earth? Because tightly strung magnetic lines do not allow plasma to safely disperse into the void. They create a rigid, highly focused rail. The 2 million mile-per-hour solar wind erupting from the sun's unsealed void is no longer drifting freely outward. It is locked onto these tightened, rigid tension lines. The path between the sun and our planet has been stripped of its buffering capacity. The rail is taut, the current is flowing, the impact is mathematically guaranteed. Part 13. Amplifying the solar maximum. We are taught that the sun is an independent engine. We picture a self-contained nuclear furnace, ticking away on a rigid 11-year cycle, completely oblivious to the tiny rocks circling it in the dark. For decades, orthodox astrophysics has treated the concept of planetary influence on the solar dynamo as a mathematical absurdity. The planets are too small. The distances are too vast. The gravitational mechanics, the consensus argued, simply do not support it. But the telemetry of late April 2026 is aggressively challenging that consensus. To understand the deeply sobering, highly controversial theory of planetary tidal forcing, we must look beneath the blinding surface of the photosphere. The sun is not a solid, rigid object. It is a massive, spinning sphere of electrified fluid. Deep within its convective zone, immense currents of highly charged plasma flow from the equator to the poles and back again, generating the sun's colossal magnetic field. This is the solar dynamo. It is the beating heart of our star. When this internal dynamo becomes unstable, the magnetic field tangles, sunspots erupt, and massive coronal holes tear open. We call this period of peak instability solar maximum. The orthodox view claims the timing of this extreme solar maximum and the 5-planet alignment is purely coincidental. The planetary hypothesis claims it is actively catalytic. Consider the everyday physics of a terrestrial ocean. The Moon, despite being a microscopic fraction of the Earth's mass, exerts enough gravitational pull to visibly drag billions of tons of water onto our shores. This is a standard tidal force. The planets exert a similar, albeit vastly more subtle, tidal force on the fluid plasma of the Sun. Individually, the gravitational tug of a planet like Earth or Mars on the solar interior is virtually undetectable. It is statistical noise. But we are not dealing with individual planets scattered randomly in the void. We are dealing with a stacked, asymmetrical alignment of Earth, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, and Neptune. When these 5 massive bodies cluster into a narrow heliocentric longitude, their combined gravitational and magnetic vectors mathematically synchronize. They stop pulling in opposing directions. They unite. This combined planetary torque does not have the raw strength to physically rip the Sun apart, but it does not need to. It only needs to disrupt the delicate fluid equilibrium of the solar interior. Astrophysicists who study planetary spin-orbit coupling track these fluid disruptions through a phenomenon known as Rossby waves. Imagine a perfectly balanced spinning top. If you gently but rhythmically tap the side of the top at the exact right frequency, the top will not immediately fall over. but its internal momentum will begin to wobble violently. The planetary alignment acts as that rhythmic, compounding tap. The stacked gravitational pull reaches deep into the sun's convective zone, generating massive, slow-moving vortexes of current, Rossby waves, that violently agitate the solar dynamo. The planetary alignment is not creating the solar maximum out of thin air. It is acting as a massive, invisible metronome, mechanically synchronizing and amplifying the chaotic magnetic instabilities already churning inside the star. The planets are applying the torque, the dynamo is destabilizing. The gaping equatorial coronal hole is the physical fracture resulting from that stress. We are forced to confront a deeply unsettling clockwork reality. The Earth is not merely a passive, innocent target for the incoming 2 million mile-per-hour solar wind. By actively participating in this geometric alignment, our own planet's mass is gravitationally complicit in pulling the trigger. Part 14. The Mars CMEs. While Earth braces for the relentless high-speed jet stream escaping from the equatorial coronal hole, an entirely different class of stellar weapon is currently in transit. We are not tracking a continuous open-valve leak. We are tracking a catastrophic structural detachment. Two massive clouds of heavily magnetized plasma, interplanetary coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, have violently severed their ties to the Sun and are racing outward into the dark. To understand the kinetic profile of an CME, we must look at the violent architecture of the Sun's lower corona. It is a chaotic fluid environment dominated by intensely localized magnetic fields. Under extreme stress, these invisible lines of force become tangled and sheared. They twist into massive, unstable helixes known as flux ropes. When the physical tension within these coiled ropes exceeds the structural limits of the surrounding atmosphere, a process called tether cutting occurs. The magnetic lines snap. They violently reconnect beneath the rope. They explosively decouple from the star. In a matter of seconds, billions of tons of superheated protons and electrons are forcefully expelled into the vacuum. This is not simply a gust of solar wind. It is an ejection of mass. It is a piece of the Sun's own magnetic field physically torn away and hurled outward. The anomaly we are tracking today is a dual launch. 48 hours ago, an initial sluggish CME was expelled from an active region in the Sun's northern hemisphere. 12 hours later, from the exact same structural fracture, a second, vastly more energetic eruption occurred. Because the second CME is traveling at nearly twice the speed of the first, it has closed the gap. It is currently rear-ending the slower cloud. In the cold physics of the heliosphere, this is known as a cannibal CME. When the faster plasma cloud forcefully overtakes the slower one, they do not simply bounce off each other. They physically merge. The immense magnetic fields of the two clouds compress, forcing their internal plasma structures into a single, highly turbulent kinetic wall. If the magnetic alignments of these two clouds violently oppose one another, they trigger secondary magnetic reconnection deep in the vacuum of space. The merging clouds effectively become an unmoored particle accelerator, generating localized thermal spikes and intense radiation bursts as they travel. Scale is uniquely difficult to comprehend in a vacuum. As an CME travels away from the immense gravity of the Sun, the drop in external pressure causes the plasma cloud to violently inflate. By the time this cannibalized structure reaches the orbit of Mars, it will not be a localized pinpoint projectile. It will be an expanding, inescapable net tens of millions of miles wide. The planet will not simply be hit by the cloud, it will be entirely swallowed by it. The trajectory is mathematically locked. Due to the specific heliocentric longitude of the eruption, this massive kinetic wall is completely bypassing Earth. It is traveling down a separate, isolated orbital vector. Its target is the red planet. When a merged ICEM of this magnitude strikes a planetary body, the impact is a three-stage mechanical assault. First comes the interplanetary shockwave, a dense, invisible wall of compressed ambient solar wind pushed ruthlessly ahead of the plasma cloud. Next arrives the sheath, a violently turbulent region of heavily compressed, fluctuating magnetic fields that strips away outer orbital defenses. Finally, the core of the CME itself impacts, a massive, twisting flux rope of dense plasma that will subject the planet to a continuous crushing magnetic load for up to 36 hours. The timing of this dual strike elevates it from a localized space weather event to a systemic, heliospheric crisis. At the exact moment the inner planets are gravitationally aligning and the Earth is being battered by an open valve stream, Mars is about to absorb a direct, point-blank blow from the sun's heaviest artillery. We use the term absorb deliberately because, unlike Earth, Mars possesses a deeply fatal planetary-scale vulnerability. The red planet is fundamentally missing its armor. Part 15. The Martian Magnetic Anomaly. To understand what is about to happen to Mars, we must look deeply at what is missing. Earth survives the daily kinetic assault of the Sun because we possess a unified, global magnetosphere generated by the churning of our molten iron core. This invisible shield acts as a planetary-scale bow shock, violently parting the solar wind and safely guiding the vast majority of lethal radiation around us. Mars possesses no such armor. Roughly 4 billion years ago, for reasons geophysicists still debate, the molten interior of the red planet cooled. The convective currents slowed. The internal dynamo died. It is cold. It is geologically inert. It is structurally defenseless. But Mars is not entirely devoid of magnetism. When the planet's global shield collapsed billions of years ago, the iron-rich rock of the Martian crust locked in the magnetic alignment of that exact moment. Today, Mars is covered in localized, highly irregular patches of fossilized magnetism. These are most prominent in the rugged southern highlands, specifically the heavily cratered regions of Terra Cimmeria and Terra Sirenum. Astrophysicists call these localized fields magnetic umbrellas. They project a few hundred miles up into the vacuum, offering patchy, disorganized protection to the rock below. During the quiet background flow of the baseline solar wind, these umbrellas manage to hold the line. They deflect the ambient plasma just enough to keep the thin Martian atmosphere from boiling entirely away into the void. But a cannibalized interplanetary coronal mass ejection is not the baseline solar wind. When the immense, highly compressed shockwave of the merged ICME violently strikes Mars, these localized magnetic umbrellas will not hold the line. They will be immediately, ruthlessly crushed. Because Mars lacks a unified magnetic field to stand off the blow, the plasma cloud will slam directly into the planet's fragile upper atmosphere. This triggers a terrifying, invisible process known to planetary scientists as atmospheric sputtering. To visualize sputtering, do not think of wind blowing away smoke. Think of a microscopic, planetary-scale sandblaster. The incoming solar protons and heavy ions in the ICME are traveling at millions of miles per hour. When these highly energized projectiles impact the carbon dioxide and oxygen molecules in the Martian exosphere, they do not simply push them. They strike them with such devastating kinetic force that the atmospheric atoms are violently accelerated past the planet's escape velocity. The molecules are physically knocked out of the planet's gravitational grip. They are ejected into deep space. The loss is absolute. Data recovered from the MAVEN spacecraft during severe solar storms has proven that when a dense CME hits Mars, the rate of atmospheric escape does not simply increase. It spikes by a factor of 10 to 100. Thousands of tons of vital oxygen and carbon dioxide are stripped from the planet in a matter of hours. The very chemical building blocks of the atmosphere are systematically harvested by the sun. But the physics of this particular dual ICME strike are infinitely more aggressive, as the incredibly dense, magnetized sheath of the cannibal CME wraps around the planet. Its immense magnetic field physically drapes over Mars. Because plasma conducts electricity, this draping process induces massive electrical currents directly within the thin Martian ionosphere. These induced currents create localized, highly chaotic magnetic reconnection events just above the fossilized crustal umbrellas. The magnetic field lines violently snap and violently reconnect, acting like deep space particle accelerators. They grab the freshly ionized Martian atmospheric molecules and fling them down the planet's newly formed, extended magnetic tail. We are not merely observing a dead rock absorbing a cosmic impact. We are watching the real-time, mechanical vivisection of a planet's atmosphere. Mars is actively bleeding. Every second this massive plasma cloud engulfs the planet, vital atmospheric mass is ripped away, accelerated down an invisible magnetic corridor, and scattered into the freezing void. The red planet is taking a catastrophic, unshielded blow. And crucially, the immense kinetic wake generated by this collision is not stopping at Mars. It is rippling outward, destabilizing the exact heliospheric quadrant where our own planet is currently electrically tethered. Part 16. Plasma dynamics in the Martian wake. When a solid object obstructs a fluid flow, the most violent physics do not occur at the point of impact. They occur in the blind spot behind the object. To understand the macro-level threat of this dual CME strike, we must look past the devastation of the Martian atmosphere and examine the deeply unstable void in the planet's lee. When the cannibalized plasma cloud violently wraps around Mars, it does not smoothly reform on the other side. The magnetic field lines drape, stretch, and violently tangle, creating an elongated, induced magnetotail. Inside this dark corridor, the physics are mathematically chaotic. The vacuum is boiling. Consider the fluid dynamics of a massive boulder resting in a flooded river. The water striking the front of the rock is heavy, compressed, and uniform. But the water directly behind the rock is a churning, unpredictable vortex of violent rapids. Mars is the boulder. The immense plasma cloud is the flood. The resulting wake is a deep space maelstrom. Astrophysicists analyzing the boundary layers of this wake are monitoring a specific structural collapse known as Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities. This is not obscure theoretical physics. These are the exact same fluid dynamics that cause high-altitude cirrus clouds to ripple in the wind, or ocean waves to crest, curl, and break. When two fluids of different densities and velocities shear against one another, the boundary between them forcefully rolls up into massive spinning vortices. In the immediate wake of Mars, the incredibly fast light solar wind of the CME is aggressively shearing against the stagnant, heavy atmosphere it just violently amputated from the planet. The boundary layer fractures. Massive, rolling breakers of magnetized plasma, thousands of miles high, crash into one another at millions of miles per hour. The magnetic fields twist. The plasma superheats. The wake becomes a localized particle accelerator. But this turbulent eddy is not just made of solar material. It is heavily polluted with the corpse of the Martian exosphere. Through a relentless electromagnetic mechanism called ion pickup, the heavy oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules stripped from the planet are violently assimilated into the plasma flow. This fundamentally alters the kinetic profile of the shockwave. We must look at the atomic weight. A standard solar wind proton has an atomic mass of 1. A singly ionized oxygen atom stolen from Mars has an atomic mass of 16. When the passing CME's electric field seizes these heavy Martian ions and forcefully accelerates them up to solar wind speeds, the physical mass of the wake drastically increases. This is a process known as mass loading. The solar wind is no longer carrying light, microscopic dust. It is carrying heavy atomic shrapnel. The planet's own stolen atmosphere has been weaponized. This highly charged, mass-loaded exhaust plume does not harmlessly dissipate into the void. It violently detaches. It forms a sprawling, highly turbulent secondary shockwave propagating outward through the solar system. We are not looking at a static shadow. We are analyzing a dynamic, high-energy kinetic release. And the timing of this secondary wave is deeply consequential. Because Earth, Mars, and the gas giants are currently locked into a perfectly aligned heliocentric longitude, the magnetic architecture of the inner solar system is strung incredibly tight. The Parker spiral is taut. The heliospheric current sheet is physically stressed. When this chaotic, heavy Martian wake ripples through the planetary orbital plane, it does not travel cleanly. It acts as a massive disruption to an already destabilized acoustic chamber. It fires dense, highly charged eddies of heavy ions directly across the tightened magnetic tension lines. The shock wave propagates, the structural interference spreads, and it is radiating directly into the flight path of an inbound ancient body of ice. Part 17. Comet C 2025 R3, PANSTARRS. An object the size of a small city is currently falling toward the Sun at over 150,000 miles per hour. It is ancient. It is fragile. It is structurally failing. To understand the immense thermodynamic violence of a sun-grazing comet, we must first strip away the romanticism. Comet C 2025 R3, discovered by the PANSTARRS survey network, is not a graceful celestial dancer. It is a deeply unstable, heavily fractured conglomerate of frozen carbon monoxide, methane, water ice, and primordial silicate dust. It has spent the last 4 billion years in the Oort cloud, a lightless, frozen abyss at the absolute edge of the solar system where the ambient temperature hovers just above absolute zero. It is completely unacclimated to the environment it is about to enter. As gravity relentlessly drags the comet down the steep gravitational well of the inner solar system, its velocity exponentially increases. And as the distance to the Sun mathematically collapses, the thermal radiation aggressively spikes. When the comet crossed the orbit of Jupiter, an invisible boundary line known to astrophysicists as the frost line. The physics of its existence fundamentally altered. In the vacuum of space, liquid water cannot exist. There is no atmospheric pressure to hold it together. Therefore, when the intense, unfiltered thermal radiation of the sun strikes the frozen surface of the comet, the ice does not melt. It violently erupts. This process is known as sublimation. The solid ice forcefully bypasses the liquid phase and instantly flashes into a highly pressurized gas. Deep inside the microscopic cracks and fissures of the comet's nucleus, pockets of ancient frozen volatiles are suddenly subjected to thousands of degrees of thermal shock. They immediately vaporize, expanding in volume by a factor of hundreds. This rapid explosive expansion generates immense internal mechanical pressure. The structural integrity of the nucleus, barely held together by its own microscopic weak gravity, begins to violently degrade. The crust physically fractures. Massive geysers of superheated gas and jagged dust blast out of the newly formed fissures, tearing away massive chunks of the comet's surface. This continuous explosive outgassing creates the coma, a sprawling temporary atmosphere of dust and ionized gas surrounding the solid nucleus. And this is where the scale of the phenomenon defies human intuition. The solid nucleus of Comet C 2025 R3 is roughly 6 miles across, but the coma it is currently generating has rapidly expanded to a diameter of nearly 500,000 miles. The object is physically tiny, yet it is projecting a highly volatile, heavily charged atmosphere larger than the planet Jupiter. We are not watching a rock drift past a star. We are watching a microscopic point of mass forcefully bleed an atmosphere into a vacuum. Under normal heliospheric conditions, the perihelion, the absolute closest, most perilous approach to the Sun, is a brutal survival test for any comet. But the conditions of late April 2026 are not normal. Comet PANSTARRS is plunging into the exact heliocentric longitude where the planetary alignment has critically tightened the interplanetary magnetic field. It is flying directly into the chaotic, heavily mass-loaded secondary shockwave radiating from the Martian CME strike. And most terrifyingly, its perihelion perfectly synchronizes with the massive, unsealed equatorial coronal hole. The comet is not simply facing the thermal heat of the Sun. It is flying point-blank into a 2 million mile-per-hour kinetic blast furnace, as the immensely dense, highly charged solar wind from the coronal hole violently collides with the sprawling, expanding coma of the comet. A massive shock bow forms. The incredibly delicate, newly generated atmosphere of the comet is slammed by an overwhelming wall of solar protons. The thermal shock is devastating. The kinetic friction is absolute. The physics of the inner solar system are systematically tearing the ancient object apart, atom by atom. Part 18. The comet's ion tail as a solar probe. When the general public pictures a comet, they visualize a brilliant glowing core trailing a broad, gently curving swath of light. That is the dust tail. It is composed of heavy, uncharged, silicate particles that are physically pushed away from the Sun by the sheer mechanical pressure of starlight. It is heavy, it is slow, it is mechanically simple. But there is a second tail. The ion tail is far more elusive, often invisible to the naked human eye, glowing faintly in the ultraviolet and deep blue spectrums. And the physics governing its existence are fundamentally terrifying. The ion tail is not made of inert dust. It is a massive, highly energized stream of electrified plasma. As the Sun's extreme ultraviolet radiation violently vaporizes the comet's icy nucleus, the resulting gas molecules, primarily carbon monoxide and water, are immediately stripped of their electrons. They become positively charged ions. Because they carry an electrical charge, they no longer obey the laws of standard gravity. They obey the laws of electromagnetism. When the solar wind rushes past the comet, its embedded magnetic field physically grips this ionized gas. It seizes the plasma and forcefully accelerates it outward. The ion tail does not curve. It is violently pulled into a perfectly straight line, pointing directly, flawlessly away from the Sun, extending for tens of millions of miles into the void. Heliophysicists do not merely monitor the ion tail to study the comet. They use it to study the vacuum. The ion tail is effectively a multi-million-mile-long windsock. It is an unintended, deep space diagnostic probe that physically illuminates the invisible architecture of the heliosphere. When the ambient, background solar wind is calm, The ion tail is straight, uniform and stable. But as Comet C 2025 R3 PANSTARRS plunges directly into the 2 million mile/hour stream bleeding from the unsealed equatorial coronal hole, the telemetry is becoming violently erratic. The windsock is thrashing. The high-speed solar wind stream is not a smooth current. It carries highly compressed, rigidly tangled magnetic field lines. When these chaotic lines slam into the comet's coma, they do not simply push the ionized gas aside. They electrically sever it. This is a mechanical process known in astrophysics as a tail disconnection event. We must emphasize that this is not a theoretical model. On April 20, 2007, NASA's STRO spacecraft recorded a massive coronal mass ejection sweeping over Comet Encke. The telemetry was absolute. The highly compressed magnetic field of the solar storm acted as a cosmic guillotine. The field lines wrapped around the comet's coma forcefully underwent magnetic reconnection and physically amputated the comet's tail. The head of the comet survived while billions of tons of ionized gas were completely decoupled and sent tumbling into the abyss. Comet PANSTARRS is currently undergoing this exact brutal vivisection, but on a vastly amplified scale. Because the comet is intersecting the taut, highly tensioned magnetic field lines generated by the five-planet alignment, the magnetic shear forces are devastating. The comet's massive ion tail is being subjected to rapid-fire disconnection events. It is forming, violently snapping, and reforming in real time. The ancient body of ice is bleeding immense volumes of highly charged, volatile plasma directly into the same fast wind stream that is physically tethered to Earth. The comet is no longer just an isolated casualty of the Sun, it is actively polluting the current. Part 19. Dust, Plasma, and Charge Exchange. When the 2 million mile/hour solar wind slams into the expanding coma of Comet PANSTARRS, the violence is not merely physical, it is fundamentally chemical. It is deeply electrical. To fully grasp the magnitude of this collision, we must look at the atomic level. The fast solar wind bleeding from the unsealed equatorial coronal hole is not just a stream of lightweight protons. It carries a heavy, highly charged payload of trace elements. It is saturated with bare, stripped ions of carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. These are atoms that have had their outer electrons violently boiled away in the million-degree furnace of the Sun's lower atmosphere. They are incredibly unstable. They are electromagnetically starved. They are desperate to balance their charge. Directly in their path is the comet's coma. This is a sprawling 500,000-mile-wide cloud of neutral gas, primarily composed of sublimated water vapor and carbon monoxide. The gas is cold. It is neutral. It is structurally whole. When the starved solar wind ions collide with the neutral comet gas at millions of miles per hour, a devastating subatomic heist occurs. Astrophysicists call this mechanical process solar wind charge exchange. The highly charged solar ion does not simply bounce off the neutral water molecule, it forcefully rips an electron away from it. The transfer is violent. The capture is instantaneous. The bond is broken, but this stolen electron does not settle quietly into its new host. It is captured into an extremely high, unstable energy state. To achieve equilibrium, the electron must instantly drop down to its baseline orbit. As it plummets, it bleeds off the massive excess kinetic energy. It does not release this energy as heat or visible light. It forcefully ejects it as a photon of hard X-ray radiation. We must ground this in historical telemetry to appreciate the scale. In the spring of 1996, the ROSAT-C satellite aimed its X-ray telescopes at Comet Hyakutake as it passed near the Earth. The orthodox scientific community expected to see nothing. Comets are cold, dead bodies of ice, utterly incapable of generating the million-degree core temperatures required to emit X-rays. Yet, the telemetry returned a blindingly bright crescent of X-ray emission. The charge exchange mechanism was proven. It was not a theoretical model. It was a measured, terrifying reality. Now, scale that historical anomaly to the exact parameters of late April 2026. Comet PANSTARRS is not just grazing the slow, benign baseline solar wind. It is taking a point-blank blast from a massive high-speed coronal stream amplified by the gravitational tidal forcing of a five-planet alignment, right as the local heliosphere is saturated by the chaotic secondary shockwave of the Martian impact. The volume of raw charge exchange occurring in this specific quadrant of space is unprecedented. The comet is currently functioning as a massive, uncontained X-ray generator in the deep vacuum. But the radiation is only half of the threat. The charge exchange process leaves behind the ravaged, newly ionized remains of the comet's water and carbon molecules. These are incredibly heavy, sluggish atomic structures, and they are instantly swept up by the relentless pressure of the high-speed solar wind. They violently pollute the stream. They add immense mass. They act as atomic drag. The solar wind currently racing toward our planet is fundamentally no longer just a wave of solar protons. It has been chemically altered. It is heavily mass-loaded with the radioactive ionized shrapnel of a dying comet. The wind is dirty, the pipeline is heavily saturated, the mass is incoming. Part 20. The heliophysics butterfly effect. In standard physics, we isolate variables to understand them. We put a single theory on a chalkboard, erase the outside world, and solve for X. We look at a massive coronal hole. We look at a 5-planet alignment. We look at a battered Mars. We look at a dying comet. But the solar system is not a sterile laboratory. It is a strictly coupled, nonlinear, deeply entangled fluid dynamic system. When you introduce 4 unprecedented localized anomalies into a shared conductive medium, the isolation is an illusion. The variables merge. To understand the full, terrifying scope of the convergence in late April 2026, the 2 million mile/hour plasma stream escaping the unsealed void on the Sun is the baseline kinetic threat. But as we established in Part 19, this stream is no longer pure. It has been chemically polluted and mass-loaded by the disintegrating core of Comet PANSTARRS. It is carrying incredibly heavy, ionized water and carbon molecules. This heavy, dirty plasma is not expanding safely or smoothly into the void. Because Earth, Mercury, Mars, Saturn, and Neptune share a precise heliocentric longitude, the interplanetary magnetic field has been pulled into a rigid state of high tension. The plasma is forcefully constrained. It is being funneled down a temporary, highly conductive magnetic flux tube generated by the stacked planetary wakes. The conduit is locked. The heavy plasma is accelerating. Now, introduce the final variable. Perpendicular to this high-speed, mass-loaded pipeline, a massive, chaotic secondary shockwave is rippling outward. This is the kinetic wake of the dualized CME strike on Mars, a violently turbulent eddy of twisted magnetic fields and stolen Martian atmosphere. When this chaotic Martian shockwave broadsides the rigid high-speed stream racing toward Earth, the physics of the vacuum break down into absolute chaos. Astrophysicists call this phenomenon severe magnetohydrodynamic turbulence. To visualize this, do not picture wind blowing through empty air. Picture a fast-flowing, heavy river constrained within a narrow, perfectly straight concrete channel. The water is fast, but its flow is predictable. Now, detonate a massive submerged explosive against the wall of that channel. The resulting cross-chop is immediate and devastating. The uniform current shatters into violent, unpredictable eddies. The water froths. The pressure spikes wildly in multiple directions at once. That is the current state of the inner heliosphere. The distinct kinetic forces are not simply passing through one another like light through glass. They are forcefully tangling. The magnetic field lines from the coronal hole are structurally snagging on the dense magnetic knots of the Martian wake. The heavy cometary ions are acting as localized friction points, causing the plasma to violently heat and compress. This fundamentally alters the threat profile for Earth. Our planet's magnetosphere is an aerodynamic shield. It is structurally evolved to deflect uniform, unidirectional pressure. It can withstand a heavy, steady blow from the front, but it is fundamentally incapable of defending against chaotic, multi-directional turbulence. When this entangled mass of polluted, swirling plasma strikes, the kinetic pressure on our shield will not be a steady crush. It will be a violent, unpredictable fluttering. The Earth's magnetic field will be rapidly punched, twisted, and pulled from multiple vectors simultaneously. The dayside shield will violently oscillate. The nightside magnetotail will whip erratically, triggering rapid, unpredictable magnetic reconnection events. The events have systematically compounded. The Sun fired the weapon. The planets tightened the barrel. The comet added the shrapnel. Mars disrupted the trajectory. The isolated anomalies have synthesized into a singular, highly complex kinetic storm, and it is currently breaking against the shores of our atmosphere. Part 21. Statistical anomalies and predictive models. When humanity looks into the dark to predict the weather of the vacuum, we do not use our eyes. We use supercomputers. At the Space Weather Prediction Center, The gold standard for heliospheric forecasting is a massive physics-based algorithm known as the WSA-Enlil model. It operates by taking the initial visual telemetry of a solar eruption, dividing the inner solar system into millions of three-dimensional grid points, and calculating the complex fluid dynamics of the plasma as it races toward Earth. Under standard baseline conditions, it is an astonishing achievement of computational engineering. It can predict the arrival time of a standard coronal mass ejection with a margin of error of roughly plus or minus 7 hours. But WSA-Enlil and every other numerical weather prediction model currently operating across the globe shares a fatal structural limitation. They are fundamentally designed to simulate linear, isolated events. They are programmed to model the clean, frictionless expansion of solar wind through an empty vacuum. They are entirely unequipped to calculate the thermodynamic chaos of a heavily mass-loaded, planet-anchored multi-vector kinetic convergence. It is the mechanical difference between predicting the trajectory of a single billiard ball on a clean slate and predicting the trajectory of a ball dropped into a churning washing machine filled with gravel. To understand why the mathematics are actively failing, we must examine how forecasting is actually done. Meteorologists do not run a single simulation and treat it as gospel. They use a technique called ensemble forecasting, because space weather is a chaotic system where microscopic errors in the starting data can compound into massive deviations millions of miles down the line. Forecasters run the supercomputer models dozens of times simultaneously. For each run, they inject tiny, intentional variations into the initial variables. If 45 out of 50 simulations show the solar storm striking Earth with moderate force, the confidence interval is absolute. The models have converged. But when astrophysicists input the overlapping data from late April 2026 into the computing nodes, the models do not converge. They violently fracture. When you ask a supercomputer to simultaneously calculate the 2 million mile/hour stream from the coronal hole, the rigid magnetic flux tube generated by the 5-planet alignment, the explosive X-ray charge exchange of Comet PANSTARRS, and the heavy, polluted secondary shockwave radiating from Mars, the algorithm chokes on the complexity. The resulting ensemble forecasts do not just disagree, they map out entirely contradictory physical realities. One simulation shows the heavy, mass-loaded Martian wake violently deflecting the incoming solar wind, pushing the worst of the radiation harmlessly beneath Earth's orbital plane. Another simulation shows the exact opposite. The cometary drag heavily compresses the stream, mathematically doubling its kinetic density just before it broadsides our magnetic shield. A third model shows the tightened interplanetary magnetic field lines physically snapping under the immense torsional strain, triggering a localized, deep space magnetic detonation that instantly blinds our early warning satellites. The margin of error is no longer measured in hours of arrival. It is measured in entire magnitudes of planetary devastation, and hovering above all of this computational chaos is one terrifying, unobservable variable. It is the single most critical factor in determining whether a geomagnetic storm is a harmless, high-latitude light show or a catastrophic, grid-melting electromagnetic assault. It is a metric known as the BZ. Magnetic fields possess a rigid directional orientation. The Earth's magnetic shield naturally points north. When an incoming solar wind stream carries a magnetic field that also points north, the physics are benign. The two fields strongly repel each other, acting like two opposing magnets pressed together. The shield firmly holds its ground. The plasma bounces off, the planet remains safe. But if the incoming plasma cloud is carrying a magnetic field that points south, a negative BZ orientation, the physics instantly invert. A southward magnetic field does not repel Earth's northward field. It violently, seamlessly connects with it. Through the process of magnetic reconnection, the incoming solar field forcefully merges with our planetary shield, literally peeling it open like a zipper. The defense is neutralized. The raw, high-velocity plasma pours directly into the upper atmosphere. Here is the sobering, unvarnished reality of modern astrophysics. No supercomputer on Earth, no mathematical model, and no ground-based telescope can accurately predict the BZ orientation of an incoming solar storm while it is in transit. It is a strictly invisible variable. It is entirely unknowable until the plasma physically strikes our network of early warning satellites suspended at Lagrange point 1, roughly 1 million miles upstream of Earth. Because the incoming stream from the coronal hole is traveling at nearly 2 million miles per hour, it will cover that final million miles in exactly 30 minutes. We will not have days of preparation. We will not have a synchronized global countdown. We will have a 30-minute warning to know if the door is safely locked or if the door has been blown wide open. When you compound this absolute blind spot with the violently fracturing supercomputer models and the unprecedented entanglement of 4 distinct cosmic anomalies, the scientific conclusion is deeply unsettling. The models have failed. We are flying blind into the heaviest weather our star can produce. Part 22. The Silent Watchers. We must shift our focus from the celestial mechanics to the mechanical eyes currently bearing witness. We are not blindly guessing at this convergence. Humanity has built a sprawling, highly specialized tripwire stretching from the deepest bedrock of Earth to the fiery corona of our star. The human element is removed. The machines are watching. First, look at the tip of the spear. Right now, in late April 2026, the Parker Solar Probe is executing its 27th orbital swing around the Sun. It is traveling at 430,000 miles per hour. It has plunged to within 4 million miles of the blinding photosphere. It is not observing the massive equatorial coronal hole from afar. It is physically flying through the violent, chaotic genesis of the 2 million mile per hour plasma stream. Its instruments are bathing in the raw, unfiltered source code of the anomaly. But Parker does not protect Earth. It only observes. To find our actual warning system, we must pull back to Lagrange point 1. Suspended exactly 1 million miles upstream, locked in the permanent gravitational balance between the Earth and the Sun, sits the Deep Space Climate Observatory, or DSKO-VR. It is a lonely, heavily shielded satellite. It acts as the absolute final checkpoint before the vacuum meets the atmosphere. When the mass-loaded, deeply turbulent plasma stream generated by the planetary alignment and the cometary collision finally reaches DSKO-VR, the satellite's Faraday cup will instantly register the massive particle density spike. Simultaneously, its onboard magnetometer will read the terrifying invisible orientation of the incoming BZ magnetic field. This is where the math becomes fiercely unforgiving. Because the plasma is traveling at nearly 2 million miles per hour, DSKO-VR does not give forecasters days to prepare. It provides exactly 30 minutes, half an hour. That is the entirety of the warning humanity will receive between the moment the satellite triggers the alarm and the moment the sky ignites. But the network does not end in the vacuum. It extends into the dark. Buried deep within the continental crust, shielded from surface noise by hundreds of feet of solid granite and concrete, sits the global seismograph network. It is a unified array of over 150 ultra-sensitive broadband seismometers distributed across the globe. Under normal conditions, they listen for the slow, mechanical grinding of tectonic plates. But today, they are listening for a different frequency. They are monitoring the deep Earth transition zones for the precise, localized microfractures that precede a massive piezoelectric failure. They are tracking the telluric currents. They are waiting for the rock to hum, from the scorching perimeter of the Sun to the freezing void of L1, to the crushed, electrified bedrock of the Pacific Ring of Fire. The telemetry is completely synchronized. The variables are locked. The entire observational weight of the human species is focused on a single, collapsing mathematical window. We are watching the water draw back. We are waiting for the wave. Part 23. A clockwork universe realized. For centuries, human civilization has modeled the Earth as a fortress. We mapped the continents, measured the atmosphere, and assumed the boundary of our world ended where the exosphere faded into the black. Orthodox science treated the vacuum of space as an empty, insulating moat. We viewed our planet as a closed, mechanical terrarium, strictly governed by internal thermodynamics and localized physics. The convergence of late April 2026 mathematically demolishes that model. The Earth is not a closed sanctuary. It is a highly sensitive, biologically fragile node hardwired into a massive, electrified kinetic circuit. The events we have tracked over these 72 hours are not a random assortment of cosmic violence. They do not represent a stroke of astronomical bad luck. They represent a perfectly synchronized mechanical sequence, a devastating display of cause and effect, spanning billions of miles. The variables are deeply structurally entangled. We must review the cascading energy transfer to understand the sheer scale of the mechanics. It begins with gravity. A highly precise asymmetrical alignment of 5 planets applies immense torsional stress to the Sun's internal fluid dynamo. This gravitational tidal forcing physically agitates the star's convective zone, forcefully expediting the eruption of a massive equatorial coronal hole. The magnetic seal fails. The pressure drops. A 2 million mile/hour stream of highly accelerated plasma is vented directly into the planetary orbital plane. But the vacuum does not dissipate the energy. It focuses it. The interplanetary conjunction of Mercury, Earth, and Mars creates a highly conductive magnetic flux tube, a temporary deep space conduit that prevents the high-speed solar wind from diluting. The pipeline is locked. Simultaneously, Comet PANSTARRS plunges into this exact heliocentric longitude. Through the violent subatomic process of charge exchange, the comet is stripped of its heavy water and carbon molecules, heavily mass-loading the solar wind with sluggish, radioactive atomic shrapnel. And finally, the chaotic secondary shockwave from a heavily battered Mars injects severe, multi-vector fluid turbulence directly into this incredibly dense, fast-moving stream. We are the recipients of this compounding equation. When this mass-loaded, highly turbulent wave strikes the fluid membrane of our magnetosphere, the kinetic energy does not vanish. It transforms. Kinetic pressure becomes electromagnetic induction. Space weather becomes a G3 geomagnetic storm. The induced, low-frequency direct current bleeds down through the high-voltage transformers of our power grid and surges into the deep earth telluric rivers. Ultimately, the invisible, atmospheric electrical storm becomes mechanical deformation within the quartz-rich fault lines of our subterranean rock. The sky physically speaks to the stone. The data from this convergence fundamentally rewrites our threshold for coincidence. If a distant gas giant like Saturn can gravitationally agitate the Sun's convective zone, and if a localized void on the Sun can electrically lubricate a tectonic fault line in the Pacific Ring of Fire, the concept of planetary isolation is dead. We are physically tethered to the mechanics of the outer gas giants. We are chemically vulnerable to the destruction of a trans-Neptunian comet. We are structurally bound to the magnetic ghost of Mars. Every single planetary body, every frozen comet, and every invisible magnetic tension line plays a highly consequential role in the stability of the entire system. As the supercomputers fracture under the mathematical weight of these overlapping anomalies, and as the models fail to provide a cohesive trajectory, we are left entirely dependent on the unblinking eye of DSCO VR at Lagrange point 1. We are waiting for a 30-minute warning. We are waiting to see the invisible BZ orientation of an incoming storm that carries the combined and tangled weight of our inner solar system. We are forced to accept a deeply sobering, undeniable truth. The solar system operates on an interlocking clockwork geometry that we barely comprehend, let alone control. We do not sit safely at the center of the void. We are simply caught in the gears.